Picture Ruth in 1954 stepping outside before breakfast with a basket of damp clothes. People could laugh at old-fashioned habits as signs of having less, but number 19 is the one people called especially old-fashioned, leaving the door unlocked, a quiet test of whether trust can return. During the Great Depression, thrift was survival. As prosperity bloomed in the 1950s and 60s, these practices were cast aside as signs of a backward past. The grandmother who hung laundry was seen as old-fashioned. The man who repaired shoes was viewed as stubborn. Today, facing new uncertainties, we reach back to those same habits. What was laughed at is now quietly rediscovered. Number 1. Hanging laundry on a clothesline. For generations, families lifted wet clothes onto a line, letting sun and wind dry them for free. It required skill, pinning shirts by the collar, sheets from the hem so they wouldn't sag. In the 1930s and 40s, so many homes with a yard had a clothesline. Laundry hung in fresh air came back stiff and smelling of sunshine, a scent no dryer sheet has matched. By the 1950s, electric dryers promised speed. The habit faded into a relic, but now many reconsider the cost of that convenience. Number 2. Growing vegetables in a backyard plot. During the Depression and war years, a kitchen garden was a necessity, not a hobby. Families turned over a sunny patch, planted beans, tomatoes and carrots, and tended them through summer. But after the war, suburbs grew and grocery stores offered cheap, uniform vegetables year-round. The backyard plot seemed old-fashioned. Today, rising food prices and a craving for flavor are quietly bringing it back. It was done with a seed catalog and a strong back. Families saved seeds, traded starts with neighbors, and composted scraps. The garden was a shared chore. Children pulled weeds, fathers dug rows, mothers preserved the surplus. So why did the backyard plot nearly vanish? After the war, frozen and canned vegetables became cheap and abundant. But now, as we seek better taste, lower bills, and a connection to food, the old garden is quietly growing back. Number 3. Canning and pickling the seasonal surplus. In summer, so many kitchen was a small cannery. Steaming kettles, bubbling brine, rows of jars for winter. Home canning used inexpensive glass jars and a water bath. The produce was homegrown or bought cheap. It took a long afternoon, but meant sealed summer flavor in January blizzards. Why did it fade? Opening a tin can was modern. Home-canned jars felt like you couldn't afford the store. Number 4. Mending and altering clothes instead of discarding them. In the Depression era, a ripped seam or worn elbow was no reason to throw away a garment. A mother or grandmother sat by the window with needle and thread, turning collars, patching knees, letting out hems to make clothes last. Clothes were remade, repurposed, and handed down until they truly could not be worn another day. Why did that habit fade? In the post-war boom, factory-made clothing became astonishingly cheap. A new shirt from the department store cost less than the time and effort to mend an old one. Mending began to look old-fashioned, even low-class, a mark of poverty rather than prudence. Fast fashion flooded the market, and the quiet art of the needle was edged out by convenience. Number 5. Dividing household cash into envelopes for separate needs. Before credit cards and online banking, families physically separated their money into paper envelopes labeled for specific expenses: groceries, rent, coal, emergencies. Payday meant sitting down and dividing the week's wages into those envelopes, each one representing a promise to be kept. If an envelope was empty before the next payday, that category simply went without. The system faded when banks offered easy credit and store managers accepted payment plans. Envelope budgeting came to feel old-fashioned, a relic of hard times people wanted to forget. But as debt climbs and digital spending feels invisible, the envelope is quietly being picked up again. Number 6. Borrowing an item from a neighbor instead of buying one. In a tight-knit community, you didn't need to own a cider press or a wallpaper steamer. You simply knocked on a door and asked. It began with a polite request and a promise to return the item in the same condition. This system relied on close proximity and daily face-to-face contact. But as suburbs grew and store-bought became cheaper than borrowed, the habit faded. Convenience and anonymity quietly replaced the old neighborly exchange. Number 7. Baking bread at home. A mother mixed flour, water, salt, and a bit of yeast or starter, then kneaded by hand until smooth. The loaves rose on the wood stove, filling the kitchen with a warm, yeasty fragrance. Baking day was a point of pride, a quiet assertion that her family would eat well regardless of the times. How it was done. A single batch of dough might be used for bread, rolls, and even a pie crust. The baker watched the weather, noting high humidity meant less flour. The oven's heat was judged by scattering a pinch of flour on the hearth. This was knowledge passed from mother to daughter, a skill as valuable as spinning wool. Why it faded. After the war, factory-made sliced bread became cheaper and more convenient. New supermarkets sold loaves for pennies, soft and perfectly uniform. Women who grew up during the Depression wanted to leave that drudgery behind. By the 1950s, baking at home was seen as old-fashioned and unnecessary. That pride had turned into a kind of shame. Number 8. Saving glass jars, string, and buttons for another use. Grandparents saw no reason to throw away something that could be reused. Jam jars became drinking glasses or storage for nails. String was carefully coiled and hung on a hook. Buttons were snipped from worn shirts and saved in a tin. Jars were washed and stored under the sink. String was untangled and rewound. Buttons filled a worn cookie tin. It was a quiet system of thrift that saved pennies and trips to the store. Why did it fade? After World War II, mass-produced goods became so cheap that it was easier to buy new jars than to wash old ones. Those habits quietly returned with the modern push to reduce waste. Number 9. Using washable cloths instead of disposable paper towels. Before paper towels became a grocery staple, so many kitchens had a drawer or hook full of rags and soft cotton cloths. Grandmothers cut up worn-out flour sacks, old tea towels, or outgrown cotton shirts to make a steady supply of absorbent wipes. These cloths were used for a week, then boiled clean and hung to dry. They scrubbed counters, mopped spills, and polished glass. One cloth could serve for months. Families had a system: clean cloths in one pile, soiled ones in a bucket, and nothing went to the landfill. After World War II, paper mills churned out cheap paper towels. Marketers sold them as modern and hygienic, making cloth seem old-fashioned. Now, with environmental concerns, the kitchen rag is quietly returning. Number 10. Turning leftovers into a planned second meal. A Sunday roast became Monday's hash, Tuesday's sandwiches, Wednesday's soup. The roast bones simmered overnight for broth, the fat rendered for soap. A thrifty cook saw not scraps, but tomorrow's dinner taking shape. This habit faded because cheap convenience made it feel unnecessary. Now, with rising costs, that planned second meal feels less like thrift and more like wisdom. Number 11. Keeping handwritten shopping lists and letters. Homemakers wrote down exactly what they needed, avoiding impulse buys. A letter was a deliberate act, composed by lamplight and posted with a stamp that cost real money. In the post-war boom, the telephone and computer promised speed. The handwritten letter gave way to a quick call, the list to a mental note or hurried scribble. The personal, deliberate connection became seen as quaintly slow. Today, as we seek focus and authenticity, these paper and pen habits feel fresher than ever. A handwritten list keeps us mindful. A letter, unlike an email, is a thing you can hold. That ritual of slow intention is quietly returning. Number 12. Repairing household goods before replacing them. A broken chair leg or frayed lamp cord was not a reason to throw away. It was a reason to pull out the toolbox. Families kept screwdrivers, pliers, and twine within reach, and parents knew how to patch a sole, re-glue a rung, or rewire a toaster. After World War II, factories could stamp out a plastic chair for pennies. Repairing came to seem backward, something only the poor did. It was edged out by a cheaper, shinier alternative. It was a practical skill passed from parent to child, no manual needed, just watching and doing. Repairing gave objects a longer life and saved money for things that truly needed buying. But as factories flooded stores with cheap goods, the time spent repairing seemed wasted. $1 could buy a new lamp faster than the hour to fix the old one. So the habit faded, pushed aside by convenience and disposable products. Now, with landfills full and thriftiness back in fashion, that quiet competence no longer seems laughable. Number 13. Trading useful goods and services with other families. Before money was the only measure, neighbors swapped a dozen eggs for honey, or carpentry for a butchered hog. How it was done: a family raised extra tomatoes, another kept bees, a third repaired harnesses. They met after church or at the back fence and arranged a fair trade, no coins needed. It kept money in pocket and built mutual reliance. Why it faded? The post-war boom and chain stores made cash trading seem simpler and more modern. But today, with rising costs, many are rediscovering trade. Number 14. Walking or bicycling for short errands. Before the automobile became king, trips to the grocer or post office were on foot or bicycle. It was simply how things were done: sturdy shoes and maybe a basket on the handlebars. A short errand by foot or bicycle took little more time than starting the car and cost nothing. The body got daily exercise without thought, and gasoline was one less expense. Cheap gasoline and the prestige of the automobile made walking seem low class. Now, with rising fuel costs and a desire to slow down, that old habit is quietly returning. Number 15. Making simple cleaners from vinegar and baking soda. In so many Depression-era kitchens, a bottle of white vinegar and a box of baking soda stood ready. These two ingredients cut grease, deodorized drains, and polished windows without harsh chemicals. Grandmothers mixed them into a fizzy paste to scrub sinks and stovetops, trusting what nature provided. How did they make it? For simple household cleaner, they mixed 1 part vinegar with 3 parts water in a reused bottle. It cost pennies, and so many ingredient was already in the house. By the 1950s, TV commercials promised mass-produced sprays and detergents were faster and more powerful. Store-bought cleaners felt modern, homemade felt like a throwback. Now, as people rediscover the dangers of harsh chemicals and the cost of brand names, the vinegar bottle is quietly returning under the sink. Number 16. Eating local foods in their proper season. Before refrigerated trucks and global supply chains, your grandparents' dinner plate followed the rhythm of the fields. Spring brought tender asparagus and new greens. Summer overflowed with tomatoes and sweet corn. Autumn meant squash and apples stored in a cold cellar. This wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was simply how the world worked. A housewife knew which neighbor had the best rhubarb in May, and which farmer's corn was just right in August. Putting up jars of tomatoes and pickles was not a hobby, but a duty, the only way to taste summer in winter. So many pantries told a story of the months that had passed. After World War II, grocery chains and year-round produce from California and Mexico made seasonal eating seem backward. A head of lettuce in January became a status symbol, proof you had moved beyond the old ways. But environmental cost and loss of flavor have quietly brought this wisdom back. Eating what grows when is no longer quaint, it's a quiet act of thrift and connection. Number 17. Cooking the Sunday meal together as a family. After church, many hands gathered in the kitchen. Children peeled potatoes, father carved the roast, grandmother stirred gravy. The meal took hours, And that was the point. It was a weekly anchor, a time when families connected through shared work and talk. The meal used cheap cuts, leftovers, and whatever the garden provided, but together it felt abundant. But as decades passed, this custom frayed. Weekend sports leagues, shift work, and television pulled families away. Today, the habit is quietly returning, not from nostalgia, but from a hunger for connection that takeout cannot satisfy. Number 18. Passing useful household things to the next generation. Grandparents deliberately handed down practical items while still alive. A heavy cast-iron skillet, a sturdy wooden rocking chair, hand-forged garden tools. These objects carried memory and utility together. How it was done? Families chose objects built to outlast a lifetime, things that could be repaired, sharpened, or reseasoned. When a daughter married or a son bought his first home, the gift came with a story. This bread bowl was your great-grandmother's, this hammer framed the barn. Why it faded? After the war, affordable new goods made hand-me-downs seem old-fashioned. Today, that same cast-iron skillet sells new for a premium, and its story sells too. Number 19. Leaving the door unlocked for ordinary neighborly trust. In working-class neighborhoods, an unlocked back door was a silent signal that you were home, and neighbors were welcome to step in for a chat or borrow a cup of sugar. The habit spoke to mutual reliance. Everyone knew everyone, and shame of betraying trust was stronger than any lock. It worked because the neighborhood was a village. A lock was for when you traveled miles away, not for running to the corner store. People left keys under the mat or left the door on the latch, confident anyone who came would be a friend. Why did it fade? A lock became cheap insurance against an unknown new neighbor. Our grandparents' trust was built on knowing that when you live together, you don't need to lock the door, but when you live apart, the latch becomes your only shield. Number 20. Keeping a household culture of making do without apology. In a Depression-era home, making do wasn't a pause button, it was a way of life. A ripped sheet wasn't tossed. It was cut, hemmed, and reborn as a dust cloth, then a rag, then a patch for another sheet. Nothing was wasted, because waste felt like a sin against survival. How was it done? When a cotton dress wore thin at the elbows, it was cut into quilt squares. When the kettle sprung a leak, it was patched with solder and reused for another decade. Nothing was discarded until it literally fell to dust. Why did it fade? After the war, department stores and suburban supermarkets offered the new idea of buy it new as a sign of progress. To wear mended clothes or keep using old tools seemed low class in the age of shiny consumption. The culture of making do survives only in pockets, but it's quietly returning. And so, these 20 habits, once laughed at as old-fashioned, are quietly finding their way back into our lives. Not because they are nostalgic or quaint, but because they work. They free us from debt, from waste, and from the endless cycle of buy and discard. Each one is a small act of self-reliance, a thread connecting us to a wiser, more resilient way of living. Did your family have any of these habits? Tell us in the comments below. And if you'd like to see more of this forgotten wisdom, please subscribe so it isn't lost for good.